On November 24th, 2025, Conservative leader Pauline Hanson made headlines after wearing a burqa into the Senate chamber. And this wasn't the first time she'd done it. The previous instance was back in August 2017. Hanson is the founder of the Australian political party One Nation, and throughout her career, she's been a vocal critic of immigration, particularly from Asian and Middle Eastern countries. Over the past decade, she's also strongly opposed certain Islamic religious practices, with the burqa, a full body garment worn by some Muslim women, receiving much of her attention. Hanson's push to ban the burqa was likely inspired by similar legislation that has been introduced in several European countries, including France, Belgium, and Denmark. But here in Australia, her decision sparked a major cultural and political divide. Right wing supporters praised the stunt, arguing that Hanson was defending national identity, promoting secularism, and raising concerns about security. Meanwhile, critics on the left labelled the act as Islamophobic, saying it attacked religious freedom and vilified Muslim Australians. Others argued something slightly different, that the entire stunt was deliberately performative, political theatre, a way to generate attention. Either way, the incident led to Hanson being suspended from the Senate for 7 sitting days. But if you're like me, that raises a few questions. If wearing a burqa isn't illegal in Australia, how can someone be suspended from Parliament for wearing one? And if Hanson clearly wants to ban the burqa, why hasn't she managed to pass legislation and actually do it? If you've ever wondered that, then you're in the right place. I'm Ellie, and this is No Stupid Questions in Politics. When a politician wants to create or change a law, the first step is drafting something called a bill. A bill is basically a formal written proposal for a law. It's introduced into Parliament, debated by politicians, and eventually either passed or rejected. Some bills are very short, sometimes just a few pages, especially if they're only making small changes to existing laws. Maybe they're adjusting a definition, changing a date, or altering who the law applies to. But other bills can be enormous, dozens or even hundreds of pages long, especially if they involve major policy changes. How long it takes for a bill to pass can also vary a lot. Some bills move extremely quickly through Parliament. For example, in 2018, the government rushed through what many people nicknamed the Strawberries Bill. This came after a national scare where sewing needles were found inside strawberries in supermarkets. Parliament responded by quickly increasing the maximum penalty for food contamination from 10 years to 15 years. Other laws take much longer. A legislation that introduced Australia's Goods and Services Tax, or GST, was debated for decades before it was finally passed in 1998. So, usually, if a politician wants to change the law, they introduce a bill and try to get support for it from their fellow politicians. But interestingly, Pauline Hanson didn't do that in 2017. Even though she wanted to ban the burqa, she didn't actually introduce a bill for it before walking into the Senate wearing one, which raises an obvious question. Why skip the normal process and go straight for the stunt? One very simple reason is media attention. In Australia, approximately 100 to 200 bills are introduced into Parliament every year, and most of them receive almost no public attention at all. Did you hear about the bill last year that updated the official list of contaminants that prevent people from donating blood? Probably not, and neither did I before writing this video. But Hanson likely understood this. If she simply introduced a bill, it might quietly disappear into the background of parliamentary procedure. But if she wanted people to notice her position, she needed something more dramatic. So instead, she used the burqa as a political prop. This kind of tactic is often called political signalling. It's especially common among minor parties and independent politicians. These politicians often know that the major parties are unlikely to support their proposals, which means their legislation probably won't pass. So instead of trying to persuade their colleagues in Parliament, they try to send a message to the public. Political signalling usually has two goals. The first is reassuring existing supporters that the politician is still fighting for the issues that they care about. The second is attracting new voters who may feel ignored by the major parties and are looking for an alternative. And this kind of signalling happens more often than you might think. For example, you could argue that when Greens councillor Raffaella Pandolfini wore a keffiyeh, a Palestinian scarf, to an Anzac Day dawn service in New South Wales, she wasn't trying to persuade the Labor government to change policy. Instead, she was signalling to her supporters that she took the Palestinian cause seriously. In Hanson's case, the burqa stunt likely served a similar purpose. It drew attention to her position and sparked a national debate about an issue many Australians hadn't really thought much about before. Fast forward to 2025. Before her second burqa stunt, Hanson actually did try to introduce legislation. The bill was called the Criminal Code Amendment, Prohibition of the Burqa and Other Full Face Coverings in Public Places. But interestingly, the bill didn't fail because it lacked votes. Instead, it wasn't even allowed to be debated, meaning the Senate blocked it before it reached the stage where senators formally discuss and vote on a bill, which raises another question. Can Parliament really just decide not to debate a bill? Can a politician be blocked from introducing legislation altogether? After all, proposing laws and debating bills. Surely all democratically elected politicians should have the right to be equally heard and have their proposals voted on. Well, not exactly. And this is where procedure matters. When Senator Hanson tried to introduce her bill in 2025, she wasn't blocked simply because other senators disliked the proposal. The issue was how she tried to introduce it. Instead of using the standard process, Hanson attempted to introduce the bill by seeking leave of the Senate. Seeking leave is basically asking the chamber for unanimous permission to do something immediately. In this case, to introduce the bill right then and there without going through the usual scheduling process. This is usually only granted in situations where something is urgent and everyone broadly agrees it needs to be dealt with quickly. For example, during the 2018 strawberry contamination scare. But there's a catch. Because leave requires everyone to agree, any single senator can object. And if someone does object, the request is declared not formal, meaning the proposal can't proceed that way. And that's exactly what happened here. Several senators objected, so Hanson's request to introduce the bill by leave failed. That meant the Senate never actually moved on to debating the proposal. But that doesn't mean she was completely barred from introducing legislation. Hanson still had another option. She could have given notice of the bill. Giving notice means placing the bill on the Senate's agenda to be introduced at a later time. The downside is that it joins a long queue of other parliamentary business, and there's no guarantee when, or if, even if it will, be debated. In other words, Hanson wasn't prevented from proposing legislation altogether, but she did choose a method that was very likely to be rejected, and that may not have been accidental. By trying to introduce the bill in a way that would almost certainly fail, she could argue that the Senate was refusing to hear her out. That made the latest stunt look less like a political theatre and more like a protest against being silenced. After the request was rejected, Hanson walked into the Senate chamber wearing the burqa, and that's when the suspension happened. The grounds of suspension were founded in breaching the chamber's internal rules of conduct. Specifically, the Senate determined that Hanson's actions constituted disorderly conduct under the Senate's standing orders, which require senators to behave in a way that does not disrupt proceedings or bring the chamber into disruption. Inside the Senate, order is maintained by the President of the Senate. If a senator behaves in a way that is considered seriously disorderly, the president can formally name the senator. Once a senator is named, another senator can immediately move a motion to suspend them. But this raises one more question. Why are there limits on what bills can be debated in the first place? And is that actually democratic? Well, the short answer is yes, but with trade offs. Parliament simply doesn't have unlimited time. Hundreds of bills are introduced every year, and the Senate has to prioritise which ones receive debate. Without some kind of system to organise the schedule, a small number of senators could flood Parliament with proposals and effectively bring the whole process to a standstill. This is where something called agenda setting power comes in. Major parties, especially the government of the day, usually control much of the parliamentary timetable. That allows them to prioritise legislation that they were elected to implement. Critics argue this gives major parties the ability to sideline controversial ideas, though supporters argue it's necessary to keep Parliament functioning at all. Either way, it means that while every senator can propose legislation, not every proposal will actually receive debate time. So the key takeaway is this. Hanson's bill failed because of the procedural method she used to introduce it, and her suspension happened because the Senate believed her behaviour breached parliamentary rules. And in politics, sometimes the goal isn't actually to pass laws. Sometimes the goal is to get attention. And whether you agree with her or not, Pauline Hanson definitely succeeded in doing that. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.